各位媒体朋友，各位外交部的这个同仁，以及我们的欧洲司的姚吉祥大使，还有我们在场的各位好朋友，大家午安，大家好。欢迎各位出席英国前首相这个特拉斯访台记者会。那身为之前在外交部工作，那现在也在对面工作的这邻居，我很荣幸接受邀请，来协助这场记者会的一个相关进行。那特拉斯下议员是英国的前首相及保守党的领袖，外交及政治的经验相当的丰富。他曾在2021年至2022年期间担任英国外相，过去也担任过这个国际贸易大臣，以及首位女性司法大臣，还有环保大臣。那特拉斯是这个柴契尔首相后首位来到台湾访问的前英国首相，也是台湾的长期友人。包括在担任外相期间，他多次发表对于台海和平及稳定的相关论述，以及支持台湾的国际参与，展现对台湾自由与民族价值的坚定支持。我们诚挚的欢迎特拉斯前首相出席，与媒体朋友分享访台的心得，以及近年来台湾及英国关系的相关进展。Hello to all of our friends from the media. I would like to acknowledge Ambassador Vincent Yao, Director General of European Affairs at the Foreign Ministry, as well as many other friends with us here today. Welcome to this press conference, where we have the privilege of having with us former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the Right Honourable Liz Truss. My name is Vincent Chow. I work in Taipei City Council across the street and have the distinct pleasure of being the host of today's proceedings. I would imagine all of us gathered here today know who Ms. Truss is. She's a current MP, former Prime Minister, and leader of the Conservative Party. Her career has been nothing short of remarkable, serving as Foreign Secretary from 2021 to 2022, and prior to this as the International Trade Secretary, the first ever female Lord Chancellor, breaking an important glass ceiling, and Environment Secretary. Ms. Truss is the first former Prime Minister to have traveled here to Taiwan since the late Ms. Thatcher, nearly 30 years ago, and has been an ardent supporter for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, as well as Taiwan's international participation. We extend a very, very warm welcome to Ms. Truss and look forward to her remarks in the period ahead. So with that, 我现在就会先请我们媒体朋友这个提问。那我想提醒一下媒体朋友，因为我们主要这一场活动，我们是预计有30分钟的时间，那所以我们尽量在时间内完成这个各位的问答。We have allocated 30 minutes for this press conference, and so at this time we would like to invite our friends from the media to pose any questions you may have. 我想对不起，后面那位先生是第一位举手的。对，那请工作同仁递一下麦克风，谢谢。
您好，我是独家报道的记者张英杰。我有个提问是这样子的：美国前白宫国家安全顾问欧布莱恩之前接受媒体访问指出，中国可能会在2年内入侵台湾，而中国领导人习近平也多次宣称，绝不承诺放弃使用武力解决台湾问题。请问您对此问题有何评论？谢谢。
So former United States National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien has suggested that the PRC may invade Taiwan within a 2-year time frame. Xi Jinping himself has never renounced the potential use of force. How do you see these developments?
It's absolutely clear that President Xi has the ambition to take Taiwan. Now, we don't know exactly when that could take place. We also don't know how. And it's my view that the preference of President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party would be to do it in a way that doesn't involve force, but I certainly think they would be prepared to use force if necessary. All we can do, those of us who believe in freedom and democracy, is make sure that Taiwan is protected as possible and that the Chinese government understand that there would be severe consequences if they tried to take Taiwan by force. And this is why I think it's so important that we have economic collaboration, that we're clear that sanctions could be imposed, that we have restrictions on technology exports to China, and that we are very clear that we would make sure Taiwan is able to defend itself in such eventuality. But certainly there's been all kinds of speculation about a likely date. The only answer is to prepare as soon as we can and make sure that we are ready.
Thank you. 那我想接下来，因为我们就是一家就是本国媒体在一家外媒这样子的方式来进行，所以now I'd like to open up the floor to question from the foreign press. Excuse me, from the fourth row on the left.
Hi, Mrs. Truss. Thanks for your visit and for speaking to members of the press today. My question is that your visit has already drawn anger from Beijing. After Nancy Pelosi visited last year, the security situation in Taiwan and for its people objectively worsened. My question is, did you take that into account when planning your trip? And if China again increases its military targeting of Taiwan after you leave, will you consider the trip to have been worth it? And what is your advice to Taiwan's people in dealing with that?
So I was invited to visit by the Taiwan government, and my view is that they are best placed to represent the Taiwanese people as the democratically elected government, but also that they are best placed to understand what will help Taiwan's cause. And what Beijing is trying to do is they are trying to limit visits, they're trying to limit people talking about Taiwan, they're trying to silence Taiwan's supporters and intimidate people internationally, and they try and do that in the United Kingdom, they try and do that here in Taiwan. And I think we need to stand up to that bullying, because ultimately, if Beijing is successful in reducing Taiwan's space to operate, that makes it more easy for them to achieve their objectives. So I very much take the lead from the Taiwan government about the best way to approach the situation. But my view is that when you have an authoritarian regime which is trying to expand its influence, it's now the largest country in the world economically on a purchasing power parity basis, we need to be clear and we need to be coordinated in dealing with that threat.
So we'll take a brief pause as our very talented translator on the side catches up on the last two questions. Myself as well. So perhaps we could start with the first question and then proceed to the second question. Thank you.
第一个问题的回答是我认为非常清楚的是，习近平有这个野心要侵略台湾，但是我们不知道的是这件事情会何时发生，而且会是以什么样的方式来发生。但是我认为呢，习近平还有中共的政府，他们是倾向用这个非武力的方式来进行，但是我们还是要做好相关的准备。那我认为我们所有相信自由及民主的人呢，我们都应该要确保台湾受到非常良好的保护，而且也要让中国的政府知道，如果侵略台湾的话，是会有非常严重的后果。如果他们试图使用武力的话，是会招致相当大的后果。那这就是为什么我们跟台湾经济上的合作是非常重要的，而且我们对中国也要表明非常清楚，会有相关的制裁，而且也要限制相关的技术出口到中国。所以我觉得非常清楚的是，我们要表明台湾必须要有能力可以自我防卫。我知道现在有很多种不同的说法，但是我认为最重要的就是我们要尽快做好准备。那第二个问题的回答呢，就是我来到这边是受到台湾政府的邀请，我相信台湾的民选政府是最知道对台湾人民最好的是什么样式的这个协助，所以我相信我们也可以透过此方式来帮助台湾。那北京他们现在想要做的就是试图限制来到台湾的这些访宾、这些访问限制大家讨论台湾这件事情，并且让支持台湾 湾的人今生，他们这些威吓的手段，不只是在英国，而且在台湾这边也有看到，所以我们必须要起身来反对这样的霸凌的行为。因为如果北京成功让这些人不敢讲话的话，他们之后就更容易达成他们的目标。所以我认为台湾政府当然是最知道我们现在应该做什么，所以我非常乐意的就是配合这样的这个准备的工作。那我们在面对这样的威权体制他们的扩张的时候，我觉得最重要的而且这个中国是现在最大的以购买力指数来说，他们是最大的一个经济体，所以我们对中国采取的这个立场要更加的清楚，而且也要有更好的协调。谢谢。
谢谢我们非常优秀的这个传译官。那我想接下来我们就再开放这个本媒的问题。那是不是坐在前面第2排？对，谢谢您。
I'm Chen Yuang from the Liberty Times of Taiwan. My question is, NATO is planning to open a new office in Japan, and what might be the significance for the Indo-Pacific region, and how could Taiwan engage or even cooperate with NATO countries, especially the United Kingdom? What might be the concrete step at the first stage? Thank you.
Well, first of all, it's very good news that NATO is opening an office in Japan. There's been significant NATO-Japan cooperation over the past few years, and a number of NATO allies are engaging in much deeper relationships with Japan. So the UK has recently signed a reciprocal access agreement with Japan where we conduct military exercises together, we share technology, and I would like to see more of that taking place. I think, though, NATO is inherently a Euro-Atlantic organisation. And as well as a successful NATO, I do think more formalised Pacific security arrangements are also required, given the scale of the threat that we face. So, yes, we've got AUKUS. Yes, there is the Indo-Pacific Quad. Yes, NATO has outposts in the Indo-Pacific. But separately, I think more security cooperation across the Indo-Pacific that engages with Taiwan is also important too, in order to enhance security.
所以我觉得这是非常好的消息，就是北约他们说他们要在日本建立新的这个联系办事处。我觉得就是北约跟印太区这边在前几年已经有更多实质上的合作，而且也有非常多的北约的国家都有跟日本有更多的互动、更多的合作。那我们英国之前也跟日本签署了一个互惠的通行的协定，就是我们在进行军事相关的这个军演的时候，我们会分享其中所需要的一些技术。那我之后也希望看到更多像这样的合作。那当然，北约它是以这个欧洲还有大西洋为这个基础的一个组织。那我们北约当然是非常成功的，我也希望之后看到有更多这样的联盟形成。那当然，我们有这个 AUKUS， 还有这个QUAD 四方安全会谈，所以我们希望北约在印太区这边也有更多的这个安全上的合作，而且希望是可以包括台湾的，我觉得这是非常重要的。
好，谢谢。Now we'd like to open up to a question from the international press. Are there members of the international press? I'm sorry, I think you had your hand up quite early. So,
yes,
and
hi,
I apologize.
News, yeah,
yes, could you also state your affiliation
Hong Kong
and name?
Media based in UK. So I have a question about the case of Jimmy Lai, the founder of Apple Daily. He's a British national. So his son criticized the UK government, saying that the UK hypocrisy for not standing firm enough to defend human rights in Hong Kong. So how would you reply or comment on the case of Jimmy Lai, who's still in jail because of national security law?
Well, this is, I spoke in my speech earlier about my grave concerns of what is happening in Hong Kong, and despite the fact that the UK and China signed an agreement in 1984 that the national security law has been imposed. And of course, I want the UK government to do all it can to help, but the sad reality is that freedom and liberty has been grossly diminished in Hong Kong. And when I was Foreign Secretary, we removed the ability for British judges to serve in Hong Kong because we simply did not believe the rule of law was being properly followed. So, yes, I'm sure the government is doing all it can in the circumstances, but the sad truth is we have lost freedom in Hong Kong, and we do not want to see that lost anywhere else.
所以我在刚才的这个演讲中也有提到，我非常担忧香港的状况，尤其是这个之前英国跟中国有在1984年的时候签署这个联合声明，但是即使如此，在香港还是实行了这个国家安全法，所以我们非常希望英国可以各种形式提供协助，但是事实上呢，我们看到自由在香港确实是被大大的限缩、大大的削弱。那我在担任外相的时候，我们也是这个不再让英国的法官在香港来服务，这是因为我们相信法治在香港其实已经没有办法正常运作了。我相信英国政府会竭尽所能来帮助香港的状况，但是事实上就是自由在香港已经是被抹灭了，所以我们也不希望这一件事情在世界上其他的地方发生。
好，谢谢。那我们邀请本国美。我刚刚看到婷婷好像从一开始就举手了，所以我们请这个婷婷来。
Hi, good afternoon. Mic test. Okay. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Ting Liu from TVBS Taiwan. I have two quick questions for you. Is that in your speech earlier, you actually called out for international reconsideration of economic ties with China. So how practical and viable this suggestion is, given that China is actually the world's second largest economy, and the fact that we see that, being government, there are things to consider from a more broader picture, as officials will not be able to speak much freely as you do right now as you're an MP. So would you hope that the government be more consistent and less conservative in that approach? Thank you.
So, on the point about China being the world's second largest economy, that is true. Of course, it is a fact. But if you put together all of the G7 economies plus the European Union, you get more than 50% of the global economy. And that is a significant amount of economic power. And China is very reliant currently. I mean, it's trying to domesticate more of its economy, but it's very reliant currently on exports to those nations. And at present, there isn't a coordinating mechanism for those countries to use to exert pressure on China. That is what I am advocating before it is too late and China is more dominant in the world economy. And I don't think this is something the United Kingdom can do alone. I think it is a question of coordinating with our allies around the world, the United States, Japan, others who are part of our part of the grouping who, for example, put sanctions on Russia. So I think that is what we should do, and those actions are more important than rhetoric. Ultimately, it's easy to say things, but the thing that will really change the way China behaves is if they see a coordinated economic approach from the free world, and that is what has not happened to date.
所以说，中国是全世界第2大的经济体，这件事情是真的，它是一个事实。但是如果你看 G7 所有的国家加上欧盟的话，他们的经济的力量其实是占全世界超过50%，所以也是非常重大的一股力量。而且现在呢，我们可以看到中国其实还是非常仰赖对这些国家的出口，虽然他希望自己可以更加的自给自足，但是目前还没有做到。所以我们目前还没有看到这一些自由世界的国家，他们有办法有一个互相协调来合作的一个机制，来对中国施压那这就是正是我要提倡的一件事情，就是希望还来得及的时候，中国还没有完全称霸这个全球的经济的时候，我希望我们可以有更好的合作。但是这件事情当然不是英国自己可以做到的，我们必须要跟我们其他的盟友来进行相关的协调跟合作，像是日本、还有美国、还有其他的国家这些国家可能包括就是 是跟我们一起对俄国采取制裁行动的这些国家。那最终我认为行动是比言语还要更加重要的。如果要说说而已，当然是非常简单，但是我相信如果我们要改变中国的行为，最重要的就是要让中国看到我们在自由世界，我们在经济上有更多的协调，更多的合作。
好，谢谢。因为我们现在时间不到10分钟，所以我们看说最后大概2到3题，我们时间大概加以掌握一下。那现在我们是不是请这个外媒的部分？那外媒是不是这位先生您也很早就举手了？
Hi, thanks very much for taking questions. To follow up on the question from a colleague from The Guardian, you mentioned you taking advice from the Taiwanese government as to the risks of coming here and the cost benefits involved. With respect to the interests of Britain, how do you weigh the cost benefits of a similar trip, given that the US has seen a steady deterioration in relations with China since the Pelosi trip and worsening working conditions for businessmen, journalists in the mainland, etc. So given you're already getting criticism from within your own party on this trip, I wonder what coordination you've had with the government as to the UK government as to the pros and cons. Second question is also whether you've had any advance notice of Boris Johnson's trip to South Korea and whether there's been any coordination with his office in that trip.
So we're just going back to what we're saying about visits to Taiwan, or indeed Taiwan outward visits to the free world. Are we really saying that we should allow China to dictate who visits which country in the world? Because that is essentially the counterfactual to politicians being able to visit Taiwan. And I think that is a very dangerous idea, that we should allow a totalitarian regime to dictate who goes where in the world. That, to me, is a curb to fundamental freedoms and exactly the opposite of what we should be advocating and promoting. Of course, I'm in regular touch with the UK government about my travel, always coordinate with the UK government. I talk regularly to Boris Johnson, but I'm not going to reveal any sort of detailed discussions we've had. But what the Chinese Communist Party are trying to do is they are trying to make it unacceptable for people to visit and talk to Taiwan. We should think about what their aims and ambitions are in trying to do that. Their aims and ambitions are, and they've been publicly very clear about this, trying to take Taiwan under Chinese control. That is what I don't want to see happening. And what I worry about sometimes is elements of the British press and sometimes elements of the British political system can sometimes reproduce those Chinese Communist Party lines to take. And I think the British press should be very wary about that. I don't suppose The Guardian would find much success if it was operating in Beijing. And the free press is something that is very, very precious to me.
所以呢，我们刚才就有提到这个外国的宾客来到台湾访问，还有台湾的这个官员到自由世界去访问。我们真的要让中国来决定台湾可以跟世界上哪些国家来往吗？我们要好好想一想这一点，因为这是一个非常危险的想法。如果让这样的一个集权政权来决定这个全世界哪一些国家互相交流的话，其实对自由是一个很大的限缩，而且也跟我们现在所提倡的一些价值是反其道而行的。所以我其实都有跟英国的政府有相当多的联系，相当多的沟通。 通，而且我也跟强生前首相有这个定期的这个互动、定期的谈话，但是我当然无法跟你们透露说我们都讨论一些什么。那当然，中共他们最希望的就是要让这些想要来到台湾访问或是跟台湾进行交流的这些人觉得是不能这样做的，他们是希望禁止这样的事情发生。但是我们要想想他们这么做的背后的一些野心，还有他们的目标是什么。我认为他们已经非常公开而且非常清楚的这个表示，他们就是想要侵略而且占领台湾。那当然我们不希望看到这样的事情发生。那我认为另外一个值得担忧的是这个英国的媒体还有英国的政治体系的一些元素，他们常常会把中共的这些想法在他们自己的言语当中重新的阐述。我认为这是媒体需要相当注意而且非常小心的，就是如果卫报他们这样的做法，其实到北京可能是运作比较良好的，因为对我来说，自由的媒体、自由的言论是对我非常重要的一件事情。
好，由于时间的因素，我们就开放最后一个问题。那因为刚刚都是叫前面的，所以是不是后面这位第3排坐在最右边的这位先生
？Ms. Trust, is Walter Liu for Business Today. My question is, Royal Navy sent the HMS Queen Elizabeth Strike Force to this part of Asia 2 years ago and visiting ally nations and exercising with friendly countries. Militarily, what's UK's stance in East Asia, and what do you see, or what does UK see Taiwan in this context? Thank you.
So the visit of the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier around the world was, I think, a great demonstration of the UK reaching out, working with our allies around the world. And of course, since then, we've entered the AUKUS agreement with the US and Australia about making sure that Australia has access to nuclear-powered submarines. We've also signed the agreement with Japan about joint military exercises, and we will continue to do that. I think, though, in terms of making sure there is strong Pacific defence, there are other countries that are much more central to that than the United Kingdom. Of course, we want to work with those countries, like Japan, like allies like South Korea, like Australia. We want to work, we're working closely to make sure Taiwan has the defensive capabilities it requires. But I would see other countries being better placed in terms of that Pacific alliance. I think the UK can be part of it, but I don't, is what I was saying earlier about NATO. NATO is fundamentally a Euro-Atlantic alliance that reaches out to partners in the Pacific, and the UK is we're now part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You might say that's rather strange geographically. We want to be linked into the Pacific. We want to do all we can to support our friends in the Pacific, but it will take leadership directly from the Pacific nations themselves.
所以当然，刚才所提到这个英国的航空母舰到世界各地来巡回的这个事件，它就是一个英国在努力的和盟友来进行相关合作的一个例证。那当然，英国也跟这个美国跟澳洲成立这个 AUKUS， 然后我们就是希望可以确保像是澳洲他们有核潜舰的技术。那刚我也提到，我们跟日本签署了这个共同军演的相关的协定。那我们也会继续以这种方式跟我们的盟友来合作。那最终我们是希望太平洋也可以。就是我觉得，对于太平洋的安全的情势，有其他国家是更加核心的。就是当然，我们愿意跟这些国家来合作，像是日本、还有南韩、还有澳洲，我们愿意跟这些国家来合作，来确保这个太平洋地区的这个安全，也希望让台湾有自我防卫的能力。但是呢，因为就是英国，毕竟我们像我刚才提到这个北约，它其实还是一个以欧洲以及大西洋为基础的一个组织，只是说我们希望可以跟太平洋的这个伙伴来相关的合作。所以我认为，虽然我们英国也是跟这个太平洋区域的国家，我们是相互连接的，而且我们非常支持我们在太平洋区域的朋友，但是我相信，太平洋区域的安全 还是必须要有这个太平洋国家的这些领导人来展现他们的领导力。
好，谢谢我们的传译官哈。那今天我想要特别感谢我们英国前首相这个特拉斯来到这场记者会，也花他的宝贵的时间跟大家分享对于国际情势还有台英关系的相关看法。我们很荣幸今天有他的到来。那在活动结束前，我也会再邀请他跟大家分享最后的几句话。I would like to thank you, ma'am. Thank you, former Prime Minister Truss, for taking the time to be with us today and sharing your generous and valuable insights into international politics and, of course, our long-standing Taiwan-UK relationship. We have been honored by your visit. And before we conclude, I was wondering whether you had any final words to say to the press gathered here today.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great opportunity to be here in Taiwan and to be able to speak directly to Taiwanese politicians, Taiwanese businesses, and Taiwanese people. And what I really want to say is that there is huge solidarity in the United Kingdom with Taiwan and the Taiwanese people. You are a beacon of freedom and democracy. The reason I'm here this week is to understand more about how we can engage with Taiwan and directly help, and we can work with allies across the free world to challenge China's intimidating behavior and also the economic coercion they're engaged with. And if there's one thing that I want to leave you with today, it is the fact that we need to step up that economic engagement with our key allies to be able to make sure that China isn't able to bully and coerce countries, and instead, freedom and democracy will prevail. Thanks very much.
所以非常高兴有这个机会来到这里，来到台湾，跟台湾的政府还有相关的企业跟台湾的人民来面对面直接的对话。那我想要说的是，我们在英国，我们和台湾的人民都有非常强健的这个团结之意。那台湾确实是民主跟自由的灯塔。那我希望呢，这一周就是可以了解更多跟台湾相关的事情，更加了解台湾，了解我们可以有什么样的互动、什么样的合作，还有直接帮助台湾的方式。那当然，我们也希望在自由世界，我们在盟友之间有更好的合作，来对抗中国的一些行为，还有他们经济上的胁迫。那我来这里一个很重要的想要传达的讯息，就是我希望我们在经济方面可以跟重点盟友有更多的合作、更多的互动。那这样就可以确保中国无法利用他们的经济来胁迫任何的国家。
好，非常感谢我们前首相特拉斯。那特拉斯办公室也希望我跟大家宣布一下，说这一次这个特拉斯前首相访问台湾的相关的这个发言及论述，也全数都在他的网站上，他的个人网站上，就是这个 liztruss.com。那也欢迎各位媒体朋友可以直接在他网站上去搜寻。那在结束之前，我想要特别邀请我们外交部姚司长、姚大使，还有我们外交部的同仁，我们是不是大家可以上台，大家一起进行一个大合照？谢谢。At this time, we'd like to invite our colleagues from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to join us on stage here for a big picture. 好，那我们非常感谢各位媒体朋友，也谢谢我们前首相特拉斯，谢谢。Thank you so much for your time. Very generous with your time. Thank you. Thank you. 好，那我们记者会就在这里结束。再次谢谢我们所有的媒体朋友，非常感谢大家，谢谢。